Again, my name is Mikal Kurlander. I'm a faculty member at the School of Education and longtime affiliate of the Poverty Center. I'm going to be speaking very broadly about the role of education. So education is a very critical component of the safety net for children in poverty. Everything from it is the place sometimes where kids get their primary nutrition to the space where they spend, all children spend a chunk of their day. It remains the dominant pathway to upward mobility, though that has slowed down in recent decades. And importantly, there are persistent gaps in educational attainment between children raised in affluent homes and those raised in poor families. And I could show many graphs that go with these. I just chose a few, but we do see disparities across the education life course. You'll hear about some of those today from the other speakers. We see it in early school readiness, in K-12 test scores and achievement, in high school completion, post-secondary participation, college readiness, and college degree completion. It is important to note that we've had progress in some aspects of these over the last several decades, but disparities continue to persist. I chose just to show a couple. This is in school readiness. This is a percent of kids below and above the poverty threshold. Again, there are many statistics I could have shown. This is school readiness as measured by recognizing letters, counting to 20, right names, and these are just some of the academic ones. There are many that we think of in the sort of non-cognitive, though it's not my preferred choice of words, that are about school readiness, where we also see some of these disparities, and I know others who are speaking today will speak to some of that as well. This is a very now popularized image that we see, where we see the black-white test score gap has decreased over time, where we see the income gap, that is the difference between, in terms of measured test scores, between affluent and poor families, children, I should say, in test scores, has actually risen by quite a lot in the last, even since the late 70s. And so we actually see a widening of the test score gap between low-income children and more affluent children. This is degree completion. So again, important to know is we have seen a rise in college participation among all groups, low income up through the income distribution, but we do not see the same kinds of completion rates. That's also across the income distribution, but we do know that in particular, the growth has been stagnant in college completion among low income families and also among underrepresented minority groups. All right, so I'm not going to show you a lot of graphs. I'm actually going to more talk about the sort of the explanations or the mechanisms for some of the approaches. So historically, what have we done to reduce inequality in education? We've tried to remove structural barriers. This is everything from making public education free in the era of the common school, right? So we've increased access to schooling. The largest investment in higher education has been in making college affordable for families, right? So we've increased access to schooling across from preschool all the way through college. We've had an effort to have a common curriculum. That is, what is taught in schools should look more similar today than it did several decades ago. And we've spent the biggest, I would say, social experiment has been in changing school composition, right, with the effort to desegregate as a result, post-Brown, right? So we have seen sort of the effort to have, in particular, African-American children desegregated with white children in the South has probably more than any single social policy transformed public schools in America. So school composition has been an effort to also reduce inequality. A host of compensatory policies, biggest one probably being Title I of the Elementary Secondary Education Act, have tried to have a compensatory effort to reduce inequality, particularly improving the resources for low-income children. And we try to equalize financial resources so that schools receive, so a whole host, largely I would say in the legal domain, we've tried to equalize resources for schools, and so that there's less inequality in the bottom line dollar that schools receive. I wouldn't actually call that a historic approach. I would say we're still very much kind of fighting some of those battles, both in the state but actually across the country. So what have been newer approaches to reduce inequality? Increasing standards continues to come up every time we have sort of a big push that we're kind of behind other countries, and so we've tried to raise the standards of schools. Accountability. While No Child Left Behind may be seen as a failed policy, I would think accountability probably has not been seen as a failed policy. The efforts to No Child Left Behind was probably sponsored more by civil rights groups that folks may or may not know more than any other groups who really believe that despite improvements in compensatory education policies, we did not hold schools accountable for reducing test score gaps and other inequalities between subgroups, and so holding schools accountable for some of that has been one of the most important approaches. Changing school choice options, so over the last several decades, and likely to see more of that moving forward. School choice has been seen as one effort to try to address inequality, particularly for as we see that school choice is more limited to families from low-income backgrounds. And then local control, and I'm going to say something about that at the end, just because that has been basically California's newest effort, is to try to have schools localities have much more control in the policies they use. In particular, California's effort to add additional money, a concentration factor for schools that serve more low-income students. How they spend that money is going to, I would say, remains to be seen in terms of whether it will really reduce inequality in education. So what I want to just talk about is sort of the important role of schools and whether they, in fact, have been true equalizers in this mission for sort of the, some people, whether you like to use the term the American dream or just the upward mobility that education can afford for low-income families. And so I would sort of broadly say, and there are lots of folks here who think about education in this room, and they may categorize it slightly differently, but I would say there's sort of 4 broad areas in which we think schools can be true equalizers, and the promise of those sort of depends on how we, as we go deeper into these boxes, which are actually meant to be somewhat overlapping. So the quality of teachers, the quality of the content in schools, quality of the schooling environment, the quality of peers, and I'm going to say something about each of these. So we probably know that more than any single thing that it leads to better educational achievement or attainment, I should say, is teacher quality, that having a skilled teacher very much impacts your educational trajectory. And unfortunately, it's not as simple as just teacher characteristics. We do know that there are some characteristics of teachers that are associated with higher achievement and attainment. Lots of new work in this area that suggests that teachers matter. They matter for the short term in terms of test scores and completion. They also matter for the long term, including even things like earnings, right? So we have lots of rich new areas of research in teacher quality. So we know teachers matter, but we don't really know how or why as much, I would say. So some characteristics, right? So we know that teachers who come with stronger academic backgrounds themselves tend to be better, but that's not, teacher experience, for example, is not necessarily consistent. So we see that teachers have some upward, when they start teaching, they improve quickly, but then they sort of taper off. We also have mixed evidence, for example, on certification, whether the type of certification teachers get matter. Some people would argue that sort of alternative certification programs are not as effective. Others have found that they are. So while we know teachers matter, we don't have an easy way to identify what a good teacher looks like. We do know we can see it, though. So lots of, again, new areas, the Gates Foundation, others have invested a lot in trying to understand if there are particular approaches to teaching. Turns out whether you use value-added models, which are a little more controversial in some spaces among teachers, that is the idea that we evaluate teachers based on their ability to improve test scores. Turns out those look very similar to what principals, what we might call professional judgment models are. That is, a principal who observes a teacher and can identify what a quality in instruction looks like. Turns out to be quite correlated with these potentially more controversial value-added measures. We know that engagement matters, and that's what's interesting about that is engagement, and this is also from some qualitative research. It's not just engagement with families and in the school space, it's also engagement with other peers, peer teachers, and so that is in schools that have a more tighter professional culture among teachers. We see a more positive teacher quality, teacher expectations. So we also have this kind of sense that low-income students in poverty often have experienced the sort of what's called often the soft bigotry of low expectations. That is, teachers that may care a lot about sort of making sure they're fed and well cared for, but have low academic expectations for them. So we think actually having high expectations of students, even in spaces where there's concentrations of poverty, tend to be important. We also know that teacher quality is not evenly distributed, and so quite a lot of research has shown that low-income students in poverty have less exposure to skilled teachers. And so again, I could show many graphs of this. I like this one. It's from several studies, and really what it shows is the less amount of learning that students from low-income backgrounds receive. This is free and reduced price lunch. That's that FRPL. So free and reduced price lunch students receive versus those who are not free and reduced price lunch. And you can sort of use various metrics. This shows a sort of 4 weeks less weeks of learning among English language arts, and 2 weeks less in math. And these are, I would sort of say, are sort of more conservative estimates. Others have estimated really big disparities in the amount of learning that exists between students who receive a skilled teacher versus those who don't. Importantly, the important point here is that those are not, again, teachers are not evenly distributed. We have low-income students are much less likely to receive skilled teaching. This is sliced in quintiles. We see the highest poverty schools are less likely to have teachers that come from the highest performing quintile of teaching. And again, these could be measured in lots of different ways. The main point I want to make is that it is very hard for schools who serve large numbers of low-income students or concentrated poverty schools to attract the teachers that we think of as highest skilled. And we'll say more about that at the end, but really from a policy perspective, we have to really think about how do we ensure that if one of the single most important predictors of sort of educational attainment is quality teaching, we cannot get the most quality teachers to teach in schools that are serving low-income students. That's an area I think that's fruitful for thinking about policy conversation. Okay, I don't know how I'm going to have to keep my time.
5 minutes.
I have 5 minutes. Okay, I'll go a little faster. Okay, so high quality content. Can I go faster? And I was like, slow down. At least I'm not teaching statistics, right? So I'm fast. Okay, so what do we know about high quality content? I think here what I really just want to say is more about the mechanisms. It's not just rigor for the sake of academic rigor. We think of high quality content in schools as important for several reasons. One is this idea of exposure to advanced material that prepares students across the education life course. So I'll show in a minute huge disparities in college readiness among schools that are supposedly teaching the same thing. We know high quality content is actually highly correlated with high skilled instruction, no surprise there. We also believe that when students are exposed to high quality content, they can prepare and signal future educational destinations. That happens even from a kindergarten showing up in kindergarten, being able to write their name and sort of having a teacher then make all these assumptions about their abilities compared to kids who are coming less prepared, to the sort of signal that colleges get when they see a student coming from a more rigorous academic background. Also importantly, we know that schools that have high rigor, whether it's at the school, within the school, or across schools, attract particular families and peers, and that's hugely important. I'm going to skip this graph and just show you one of my own research. This is college readiness in California on the y-axis. That is the proportion who are ready. That is inter-college, not requiring any remediation. And what you see in that scatter is California schools. And so you might think, oh, high school GPA is a good predictor of whether a student is likely to be college ready. And so again, this is high school GPA, and you can see on average, the higher the high school GPA, the more likely you are to be ready. But these are two schools in California. Two distinct schools, and so you can see in school A, or let's start with the green, in school B, while we still see that positive trend, you see a student with a 4.0 still has a roughly only 40% chance of being college and college ready to enter college, whereas the student from school A, even at 2.5, is likely to be college ready, and that's because we really do see huge inequities in the type of rigor. These are A to G classes for the California. For California folks that know. So these are students who are receiving supposedly the same instruction to prepare them for college, who have very, very different experiences. All right, peers. So peers are an important part. The biggest, what I will say actually on peers is just that peers do not, your peers have a huge influence on your own educational attainment, and in particular it's because kids are not distributed randomly in schools and even within schools and classrooms. And so we know that kids who come from low-income backgrounds, from concentrated poverty, tend to have a host of behavioral academic difficulties in schools, and those make a huge difference on all kids, even kids from high-income backgrounds. And there's concentrations of these kids also are particularly challenging for schools, high rates of mobility among low-income students in schools that make the challenges both for peers but also for teachers to teach in a rigorous environment very difficult. Okay, lastly, and then I'll sort of try and wrap this up, is a school environment. And interestingly enough here, we've seen lots of what a good quality school is. We like to call them beat the odds schools, schools that serve maybe large concentrations of low-income students who still have high test scores, and we like to model these and sort of note that there are important school reform efforts, but we often don't really know why. So we don't really have a sense of why whole schools that serve very similar populations of students, why some are more successful than others, right? It's not as simple as sort of improving school facilities. We can do that. We can equalize sort of labs. Actually, throwing money at that has existed for many decades, and we don't necessarily have a lot of clear evidence on that working. We know that leadership matters in some way, that having an instructional leader who's spending a lot of time in classrooms, a principal that actually knows what instruction looks like at the school matters. We know that the relationship between schools and neighborhoods matter, and I think you'll hear more about that today. And we know that, again, it's that schools that are that have large concentrations of low-income students particularly suffer in terms of the school environment. Importantly, it's also important to say that there has been, I think, as a result of I would say school choice and just more novel school reform efforts. I do think we know a lot about sort of things like the importance of instructional time and to what certain skilled teachers, for example, these things are all interrelated. And so I think as we have more different school models that are available to us to study, I think we will be able to tap into sort of what are the key ingredients that make a sort of broader school environment more effective than others. So finally, what are some policy responses? So strategies need to focus on key improvements to the educational environment of children in poverty. So compensatory policies and programs for basic environmental factors, I would argue, are relatively easy. We can equalize, like we can make sure that there are AP classes in every high school, things like that. I would argue that those are easy things to do, making sure that they're sort of, while the adequacy conversations are difficult, just equalizing resources. We just did it in California. We actually added additional monies for schools that are serving needier students. It's much harder to disrupt the influence of peers, and so I would argue while the first bullet is quite easy to do, the second one is hard to change families and peers. I actually think the heart of sort of improving educational mobility is in addressing instruction and content inside schools. And for that reason, I would sort of say the promise of LCFF, the local control funding formula in California, is only going to be as good as it directly addresses inequality in those two pieces, the quality of instruction and content. And to me, that means attracting and retaining skilled teachers to teach in schools that are serving students in poverty, and ensuring a high-quality curriculum with high expectations and supports for both students and teachers. And so I'll leave my discussant to respond to that, but I so far do not have as sort of strong a faith that the LCFF model is attacking schools in those particular ways, but much more broadly giving the local control options for how to use that additional concentration money. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And our discussant is Elisa Nguyen, who is coming from the Senate Committee on Budget and Fiscal Review.
That on? Can folks hear me? Okay, there we go. Okay, so I'm Elisa Nguyen. I'm a principal consultant for the Senate Committee on Budget and Fiscal Review, and I cover the areas of early education and then K through 12 education. I've been doing budget for quite a long time. I work closely with policy staff, and as anybody who works in government knows, budget and policy are closely interlinked because most policy changes also need to be funded, so it all kind of gels together in a big pot. Just want to talk about a couple things that we've, as a state, are doing that is very related to much of the research and the comments you just heard. Biggest thing that was touched on is the local control funding formula, that huge shift in how we fund schools, providing base grants for all kids and then additional funding if you're a low-income English learner or a foster youth student. So that really changed how funding has flowed to schools. We are still working on fully funding that every year. As the state has a little more money, we add a little more to full funding. We have a target level of, if we were full funded, what schools should get, and based on the most recent budget projections, we're about 96% of the way there. It may take a few more years to get full funded. The other piece of LCFF is that accountability piece, something we also heard about. The way that the state has addressed accountability is put into place these local control and accountability plans. And it's a plan that every school district, every charter school, every county office of education has to fill out that is supposed to link their basically data for schools with their goals for doing better in these areas, their actions to actually make it to those goals, and then the budget dollars and actions that they're taking to make that movement. Some of the things that we see as state priorities that they have to address in those LCAPs, as we call them, are those very same things that Professor Kurlander talked about, removing barriers, making sure there's access to the curriculum, making sure you have clean, safe environments, making sure that you're ensuring that kids are college and career ready, and then also some of those less tangible areas, student and parent engagement, school climate, that we don't have necessarily great state measures for, but we're asking locals to measure and track those things, surveys, and other types of measurement tools. And I would agree with Professor Kurlander that the jury is still out, as we've been through LCAPs for a couple of years, but this also coincided with other major changes. Switching over to new state standards, the Common Core standards in ELA and math, new English language development standards, and we're still working on some new science standards coming in. I think arguably, especially in California, most people really support these new standards. I think they provide a much better structure for students to learn, but we're still in that implementation phase. And then layered on top of that, we've also changed all of our state tests to align to those new standards. So not only are they new tests, but we were paper and pencil based before, now we are a computer-based testing system. So there have been a lot of changes to our education system. So looking at just that simple LCAP, we have limited years of data and limited years of data that really reflects multiple years of investment in these new changes. It's going to be a few years out. And then the other thing I want to mention on accountability is the other piece that's just coming out now. The State Board of Education is working on it. Our evaluation rubrics. They call them a dashboard, and it's supposed to be an easily accessible tool for schools, for districts, for teachers, parents, the community, the students, to kind of take a snapshot and say, on these state indicators, how are our students doing? So, for example, graduation rates is one. They're broken down by subgroup. They're color-coded, and it's based on how that school is doing status as well as how they're growing. So those are just rolling out this year, and they should be a tool that another tool that allows the community to hold the school more accountable and push for changes in the right direction. Again, just rolling out this year, so something we are all closely watching. And then a few other things, we've had relatively good years for the state for revenue over the past few years. It's kind of slowing down now. And most of the ongoing funding gains have gone towards fully funding that local control funding formula. But we've also had some one-time funding, and we've used it for some one-time purposes that really go in and support, I would say, some of the things we've heard. For example, just last year we spent a lot of money on teacher shortage. It's a big deal across the state. We're hearing from districts for both teacher recruitment, ensuring that certificated staff at the school district have a path to becoming a teacher. That's one of the greatest sources of finding additional teaching staff. And also encouraging universities to offer 4-year degree programs rather than 5-year degree programs to try to get more students into those programs and also get those teachers out the door quicker. And one of the areas of focus with those efforts was bilingual education, and I don't think, in California, at many of our schools, we can't really talk about low-income students without addressing English learners as well. We do have some policy efforts on the Senate side this year to work on English learner reclassification policies. And we have also done a college readiness block grant just this year. It was just $200 million, but it went out to basically high school districts or districts who have high schools based on their number of low-income English learner and foster youth. And this was really to provide money for additional opportunities for students. So whether it's A through G courses or student parent counseling, we often hear that, if you're first generation or low income, it's all on the student to figure out how to get to college. So having that also involving the parent and helping them figure out financial aid and what the options for the student are can make a big difference. And also things as simple as advanced placement fees, so paying those fees for students who need to take those exams because they have access to those courses. Finally, in the year before, we did some educator effectiveness. We used one-time money to put into those beginning teacher support programs, so mentoring and counseling for beginning teachers, professional development for struggling teachers, especially with the teacher shortage, as we know that high-quality teachers are very important. We really can't afford, though, to be losing teachers, so it's easier to invest in the ones we have and try to make them stronger at what they are doing. And then also a lot of professional development around those new academic content standards. I would be remiss if I didn't just mention early care and education. We put some resources into rate increases and additional slots. There's also been some movement towards higher quality in the past few years. This year, the governor is proposing at this point kind of pausing those increases that we've agreed to simply based on funding. So we're really hoping that we'll get a little additional resources and can continue to provide those extra dollars in that area. We know it's an especially important area for helping kids start their careers. Finally, I want to say that we all know that policies should be grounded in evidence-based research. It's really important for someone like me and my colleagues to have an understanding of the research. Things sometimes happen very quickly, but we want to set up long-term policies that will get us great results. And so understanding a little bit of the policy and knowing who to call is really helpful as we do our work over in the legislature. And also, with the limited resources that we have, it would be great if we could have what we would call adequate funding or do some of those things that everybody, research is showing are really have great results, but, we have the dollars we have, and knowing how we can target those dollars, how they're best spent. Is it early education? Is it college readiness? Is it that school that's A and B, and how we bridge that gap can really help us use our dollars effectively.
Great, thank you. So we have 10 minutes for questions. Would you guys be okay sitting in the? Are you okay with, since you can see?
I'm curious to hear your response, McCall, to the comments. If you were to get the phone call, we have limited dollars, how should we best invest them? What would you say?
Geez, that's a hard question. I think, I guess I would probably throw it back to Alex a little bit just to sort of say, I think having the sort of idea of having schools know best how to spend their resources is compelling to me. Having said that, I think some effort of ensuring that the concentration dollars are spent on the neediest students in the form of the sort of where I would think the research base is strongest, that is rigorous content and skilled teachers is where I would spend the money in terms of fundamentally addressing who's in the classroom in these schools and what is the content there. But of course that's really hard to do. My sense, the reason I would say I would throw it back is because my sense is that the dollars currently are being seen as more flexible for broadly sort of contracts for teachers or others. And so I think right now what I would say is I would want to also make sure that they're spent the way they're intended to spend, but also that there's important evaluation or tracking on those dollars in terms of if we see there's any evidence on whether it works. To your broader question on where research, so I think I agree that teacher development is an important area. I would say, like I said, we know a lot that teachers matter, but I don't think I would invest in sort of trying to understand how to improve some of the teachers who are currently in the classroom and how to give them additional resources.
The only thing I would add to that is, I think with LCFF, we were lucky. We were coming out of a recession. We were able to add a lot of new dollars, but districts are facing a lot of pressure and have with, having a teaching staff that faced years of cuts. They had a lot of pressure to provide salary increases, and we know the bulk of the spending of a school district as its employees. The guidance for expending those funds, especially the concentration and supplemental funds, was put out through the State Board of Education, and it really threaded a needle. It basically said, you need to use these funds to increase or improve services for those students. You can measure this qualitatively or quantitatively. So it gave them some wiggle room as long as they showed that they were doing more for those students. A lot of the advice to school districts was, yes, you can raise salaries, yes, you can increase your teaching staff, but link that to things you're doing for those students. Do you need more English learner coaches? Do you need more bilingual teachers? Do you need more high-quality teachers across the board because you're a school that serves predominantly low-income students? So we encourage school districts to do that. We know when it comes down to balancing a school budget, these are difficult things to do, and choices have been made. I think as a state, we're relying on those outcomes to push schools to continue to do the right thing, to say, is that helping my students and my student subgroups move forward where they need to?
Given that we're likely to be facing changes in the federal allocation of education dollars, particularly likely to be coming down on aspects of school choice and how funds are being allocated for school districts and families to be able to determine which schools they have, and how that might funnel money away from public education into charter school systems. How do you see the state positioning itself to be addressing these issues that Nicole is raising with regard to where do we need to be focusing efforts to identify improving school performance and success with the likely changes in allocation money?
Sure, that's a difficult question. We're all in early days of kind of watching this unfold. Looking at federal funding, it's about 10% of the funding that our K through 12 schools get. A large chunk of it is that Title I funding that specifically goes based on the number of low-income students, and it's not spread evenly. Clearly, schools that have more low-income students really depend on that funding more. Having said that, it's not a huge amount of money. It's about $2 billion, based on the some 50 some odd billion, close to 60 billion that schools are getting through the local control funding formula. So at this point, we're waiting to see what rolls out, and then we'll, as a state, determine how to react to that. I think there are many states and many schools that depend on this, and so, switching all those funds over to simply school choice may be, more difficult, than folks are talking about at this point. But until we, see what the actual plan is that we'll go through, it's a little hard to react too much. Sorry, a little bit of a dodge of the question, but
There's time for one more question. Oh.
I have one more for each of them. First, with regards to research, could you speak for a moment, you touched upon it briefly, the relationship between the negative impacts of poverty on children and their well-being, and that relationship to their ability to participate appropriately in class. Can you talk more about how that research should or can or is contributing to changes in policy in suspension and discipline in school, and why that's important? And if there's time, could you speak briefly? We've talked a lot about kids that get to school. What about the kids that don't get to school? We know truancy is still really high. It's really high among low-income kids. Our transportation budgets have not increased, and we have far fewer kids getting transportation funded to school than they used to. If you can speak from the Senate Education Committee about that.
Great. Well, the mechanism, the stressors attached to poverty and equality, I know you're going to hear about, in particular from my colleague Ross. So I'll say the why we know that children under poverty experience a host of stressors and what that leads in terms of their outcomes. I'll say, but on the specifics of discipline, I will say, I think there's, I would say in the last decade, a real rethinking about the role of discipline and suspensions and truancy in schools in terms of school leadership. A lot of effort has been made to sort of demonstrate, maybe over more than a decade, the disproportionality, and particularly by race, by gender, in who gets suspended and what discipline looks like. We sort of we see a reduction in zero tolerance policies across the country after lots of efforts to sort of suggest that they didn't necessarily work and that they led to further negative outcomes for children. Restorative Justice, of a colleague now who's doing this work at UC Davis, efforts to sort of think differently about discipline in schools from elementary through high school, given the high rates of school to prison connections. But what that looks like broadly for school reform, I would say one of the reasons that, interestingly, the school reform models, charter schools that had increases in test scores were also charter schools and school models that have very sort of strict leadership and kind of conducts of learning and operating in the school that were seen as sort of no excuses or sort of no, very little high discipline kind of spaces, in addition to, despite the sort of reduction in suspension and truancy. And so we have a little bit of a dilemma there, which is that we know that kids who are in schools where they spend a very large portion of their day, that is, there's very little freedom in how they behave during the school day and they have long instruction times, tend to be associated with higher test scores, but we also, those are schools that are often seen as sort of, by some educators, as more oppressive places where there's less creativity and room. And so I think we still have a ways to go in sort of how to think about the schooling environment and why some kids, particularly kids in poverty and low-income students, and really students from racial, ethnic minority groups, tend to be in schools that look discipline-wise very different than affluent kids, where there's a lot more freedom in space. And so I don't have an answer for you on whether, I would just say that your observation is true, which is that if you walk into a school that's considered by all standards successful in terms of test scores, that is serving high concentrations of poverty kids, it looks very different than a successful school that is serving affluent kids. And it's often in these kind of leadership or sort of discipline kind of codes of conduct.
And then I'll just add for the question on transportation, under LCFF, transportation funding was rolled in. It's an add-on for some schools. From just the Senate budget perspective, I don't see, especially under this governor and with the current funding levels, that we'll be doing statewide funding again for transportation. School districts can and some do use their LCFF dollars for transportation, but we know it's a real budget crunch for some of those school districts. So at this point, I don't see it on the horizon, as a separate categorical or anything like that.
Thanks very much to both of you.